Hi everyone, welcome to session number 4 of our ICA post-conference event called Digital Platform Regulation Beyond Transparency and Openness. Today I'm joined by Russell Newman from the Emerson College and Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Next up, we'll hear from Nirit Weiss-Blatt from the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. And then up next, we'll have Popiel from the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, so I'm just going to begin with some opening remarks by Professor Terry Flew. So the underlying idea behind the Digital Platform Regulation Beyond Transparency and Openness ICA post-conference has been to address the significant change in public and policy discussions around digital platforms that occurred over the course of the 2010s. While that decade started with social media being largely heralded as bringing forth a new era of openness and collaboration, the decade ended with scandals such as Cambridge Analytica, concerns about the role of digital platforms in the dissemination of disinformation and fake news, and the techlash against the perceived monopoly power of the largest digital platform companies in key markets such as search, social media, and digital advertising. Associated with this has been the structural shift in media consumption towards content delivered through digital platforms and the crisis of traditional media industries and professions, most notably news and journalism. Associated with this techlash has been a series of public inquiries, reports, and new laws and policies addressing the power of digital platforms from perspectives ranging from competition and copyright policy, bargaining relations with traditional media, and content moderation standards. It is estimated that there are or have been over 50 such inquiries taking place around the world. Beyond the content of these inquiries, laws, and reports, they mark a moment where nation states have become increasingly assertive around their powers related to digital platform industries and digital content. The COVID-19 global pandemic has seen digital platform companies strengthen their relative economic position and increasingly appear as public utilities in the age of connected yet vulnerable, interconnected yet vulnerable citizens. For reform advocates such as Senator Elizabeth Warren in the United States, this period marked a moment where the public utility dimensions of big tech warrant strong public interest regulations, as well as strong antitrust laws that require structural separation within these tech giants in order to enable fair competition. Others, such as Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, see the times of the pandemic mean that the challenges we face demand an unprecedented alliance between business and government. At the same time, there is a lack of consensus about what digital platform regulation could or should involve. It is unclear, for instance, whether it should involve a refining of existing forms of communications and media policy to incorporate the role now played by digital platforms as quasi-publishers of increasingly popular digital media content, or whether the principal issues such as monopoly power and consumer protection are best addressed by variants of economic policy. The balance between nation-state regulation and supranational governments is also a subject of considerable debate, as is the extent to which soft law and platform brokered arrangements such as the proposed Facebook or now established Facebook Oversight Board or Tim Berners-Lee's contract for the web may substitute for nation-state regulation. At a time of growing tensions among leading world powers, the divergence between forms of internet governance and the possibility of a global splinternet also needs to be considered. A Chinese digital ecosystem has evolved largely independently of the dominant Western players, and the relationship of the big Chinese tech giants such as Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei to Western digital markets has increasingly been overlaid with concerns about a new Cold War between the US and China. So these are among the many issues that animate this and other panel discussions in this event. Okay, so now we are going to begin with Russell.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you all very quickly here. Well, good afternoon, or whenever you happen to be watching this. My name is Russell Newman. I am now associate. I learned 2 hours ago I was granted tenure by my institution, so I'm in a slightly good mood this afternoon. So I teach at Emerson College in Boston. I'm now associate professor of digital media and culture there. And I wanted to do a bit more, almost of a meta presentation today. So a couple key things that I think about when I think about digital platforms today include how folks are thinking through antitrust. And one of the chief moves of the last few years was Lina Khan's and the Amazon's antitrust paradox, where she offers a full frontal assault on the use of Chicago-style antitrust to analyze a company or a platform like Amazon. She argues we need to look at the entire business structure, not just price and welfare calculations, and acknowledges that things that the Chicago model tosses overboard as irrational, like predatory pricing, is actually taken as beneficial to consumers. We have all these other issues with antitrust right now as well, such as the Ohio versus American Express ruling from the Supreme Court of a couple of years back that declared that in a multiple-sided market, all sides need to be harmed in order to be addressable by antitrust. She's speaking to Adam Greenfield's notion of stacks. And when we're thinking about stacks, we're thinking about large entities like Amazon that themselves are huge self-contained units that have been growing over time, incorporating new elements into themselves, that are themselves transforming logistical processes. And he's thinking about these as large units. Now, to that end, we've seen some initiatives to address such entities. We've Tim Wu's recent The Curse of Bigness looks to address this as well. The British have investigated with their own report that came out just over a year ago, which is rather interesting, and one of the many inquiries that are going on right now, is noted in the introductory remarks. By the same token, we've seen ex-presidential candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders arguing for the breakup of these large units. And something and we've even seen legislation, as well, to break up these units. I want to make two interventions today in this brief presentation. One, I want to argue that new problematics of the present environment remain unaddressable by any of these frameworks. It's going to lead to a bit of a re-theorization. It's time to supplement calls for platform regulation with what, for lack of a better way of expressing it, is a processional approach to regulation. That's theorization. So let me start with the first of these tickets. A number of years back, those who have been following telecommunications politics in the US are well aware that Verizon, for instance, purchased AOL. And the reason they purchased AOL was largely for its one of the world's largest advertising networks, incorporating all the data they had about the browsing of users worldwide into their bailiwick as well. They purchased Yahoo and closed that sale a couple years back for exactly the same reason. Yahoo operated one of the largest advertising networks and advertising exchanges at the time. And these have now been folded into a unit that was initially called Oath, but is now called Verizon Media. And in fact, in their 2019 annual report, they noted how they have actually reorganized their business around consumer, business, and media divisions now. They're arguing there are ways for you to partner with them in all sorts of new ways via such things as they're now expanded as of a couple of weeks ago, maybe not even that long, about a week ago, expanding their demand side platform, providing access for advertisers to native advertising and more across all the screens that Verizon can find their users. As well, and other kinds of partnerships. Back when they called themselves Oath, they were telling their advertising partners that you could take advantage of web users mistyping addresses into their browsers. You could, it's a win-win. You're assisting your users while creating a new revenue stream for yourself. We can create an advertising opportunity for you when users make the mistake. It should become as little surprise, although while Google itself had been announcing over the last few years they were slowing down on doing such things as reading consumer emails in order to provide advertisers more information, although this isn't entirely accurate. They were largely handing it off to third parties. The Wall Street Journal reported in late 2018 that Yahoo continued to actually read emails, arguing email is an expensive system. I think it's reasonable and ethical to expect the value exchange if you've got this mail service and there is advertising going on. So Verizon customers continue to have their email, which has now been shunted to Yahoo and AOL, continue to be read for the purpose of advertising. 2019, we saw telecom players and others speaking to the problem of what has been termed an identity crisis, which is kind of a slick way of saying, how do we follow individual users across our ecosystems? And we've seen numerous entities grow to try and address exactly this problem, such as the Trade Desk, which amusingly today referred to the process as transferring media to the benefit of humankind, with one of the ways they're doing this, providing a unified ID solution with a variety of partners that work in MarTech, our ad tech, and beyond. How do we follow individual users around? How do we target our desired audience as opposed to waste? Additionally, over the last 2 years, consortiums have developed kind of a unified way of thinking through users. In this instance, the Advertising ID Consortium is an open and independent organization comprised of companies spanning the digital advertising industry that provides an open identity solution for the ecosystem, founded by AppNexus, which offered itself one of the large advertising exchanges, Index Exchange, LiveRep, which is an onboarding system. How do we connect users online and offline activities? The consortium enables buyers and sellers of programmatic advertising to leverage people-based marketing to create more relevant campaigns. Leave it to a telecom company to spoil the party when AT&T jumped in and purchased AppNexus in the middle of 2018, thus forming a modern media company, in their words, a stack of content, data, ad tech, and distribution tuned to maximize their tandem value. This has now been consolidated in a unit they call Xandr. And additionally, they're continuing to tackle this problem, a surge in CTV viewing. How, again, same problem. How is it that we can follow an individually desired consumer across all their devices, which adds an entirely new dimension of meaning to the now closed AT&T Time Warner deal, one of the largest conduit and content combinations in recent history. Now, that British report that I spoke of before acknowledged that companies like Verizon are now becoming big players in the advertising universe. 2/3 of all advertising dollars still continues to go to Google and Facebook, but Verizon absolutely is a player, albeit they recognize themselves in their annual reports that they're still struggling to compete against these actors. And critics were telling them you're actually not being invasive enough with your users. And in the 2019 annual report, they note that they're experiencing pressure from search and desktop usage and believe the pressure in these sectors will continue. They are implementing initiatives to realize, quote, synergies across all of our media assets and build services around our core content pillars to diversify revenue and return to growth. And this is a big deal because of how many pots a company like Verizon has its finger in. For instance, they're now working in 5G on edge computing. They're seeking to insert themselves as a key enabler of the Internet of Things, both for consumers as well as for industrial players. And curiously, they're combining efforts with Amazon. They're working with Amazon Web Services to do this. Additionally, they work in energy. In fact, in an older version of their website, they were more than happy to talk about all the sectors in which they worked: construction, education, energy and utilities, the federal government, financial services, healthcare, insurance, manufacturing, automotive, media, entertainment. They are not shy about their involvements in all these industries. So synergies remain rather powerful to exploit, particularly as in their 2017 Internet of Things report, they talk about all data within their ecosystem. How can we make value ascend the data value chain? How can we apply information we obtain about a user's activity at one end of the network and apply it at other ends? And how can we facilitate this for our partners? Which leads me to the second intervention that I want to make. So when we consider these stacks, I want to make an argument that we actually need to move to logistical processes in our theorization of platform regulation itself, because things have become very weird. On the one hand, new forms of competition are evolving. I mean, because of these moves of broadband operators like Verizon and others, the large global advertising giants themselves have sought to jump into the data gathering game themselves with huge deals like Publicis acquiring Epsilon in a $4.4 billion deal and IPG buying Acxiom. Now, Acxiom and Epsilon are two large data collection and analysis entities. So classic advertising giants, which are less companies than umbrella companies of thousands of advertising companies themselves, are very threatened by this and are looking to beef up their ability to trace individual users to solve the identity crisis of 2019-2020. And things get even stranger when Verizon is teaming themselves with a company that has rebranded themselves last year as Ampersand, which was founded by cable companies, Cox, Charter, and Comcast, which serves to find users across their devices. It turns out Verizon's Fios fiber system will be cooperating with those across all their networks. And this is also international. Telefonica, a Spanish telephone company, is collaborating with Verizon in exactly these aims as well, sharing data across the ocean. So new forms of competition are evolving. And at the same time, while stacks are worrisome, when we consider the internal dynamics of someone like an Amazon transforming logistical processes from the creation of goods to their delivery, processes themselves, which might even be more complex, are key and might even encompass multiple stacks. I mean, to this end, over this last semester, I was invited to take part in a couple of phone calls from the so-called Open Voice Network, which is a variety of partnerships of corporate entities that were seeking less to figure out open standards for incorporating voice into education and more than just looking for educators to jump in and say, let's not fear voice. And make no mistake, open is a misnomer. It has nothing to do with open. We're talking about a set of standards developed by platform giants that now they're hoping to slot education into. Entities like IFTTT, If This Then That, which has existed for a while but got a new infusion of funding in 2018, have been working with broadband operators and other brands to enable you to do such things as, at a notification in my email that I got tenure, I can enable Paul's garage door to open and close repeatedly for 24 hours or so. IFTTT is the kind of site that enables me to perhaps do such a thing, and at the same time, collect information about users that use these tools. And I find it hilarious too. When I was taking screenshots of this site, the user ends up falling through the floor and swallowed up by their devices and their networks. Beyond the concentration of firms, which has been a huge concern here in the US, the potential for oligopolistic logistical processes themselves, standardized ways of doing certain things, might pose even greater challenges that themselves are not even addressable via classic antitrust policy. So a new processional antitrust may be necessary to theorize when we think through platform regulation, even as all these platforms form part of a media ecosystem that's supposed to serve the ends of liberal democracies, right? We depend on these things for the consumption of information that might feed into an election later on this year, but when at the same time, everything you consume, everything you create becomes one more data point in broader logistical platforms. And I look forward to discussing all of this with you. Maybe I'll be less caffeinated, about 20 minutes or 30 minutes or so, we get through everyone else. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Russell. That was excellent.
So now we're going to move on to Nirit.
Yeah, thank you. Let's do that. Okay, you can all see it? Great, so I'm going to present the techlash research, the shift in the tech coverage and the tech companies' crisis responses to this shift in tech coverage. Prior to my research fellowship at UC Annenberg, I was in the tech industry. So I was a tech PR professional and later a tech journalist. And being on two sides of the fence dramatically shaped my studies, which examine both tech news and tech PR. I will summarize my previous research, which captured an era I'm calling the pre-techlash era, the current project, which captured a totally different era, and I'll finish with some thoughts about the near future. In the pre-techlash era research captured in 2012, I analyzed the leading tech coverage from the US. So that was tens of news sites from traditional media and tech blogs. I used hundreds of tech keywords in a media monitoring tool, and it resulted in 1.5 million records. So those articles and posts. And from comparing all the broad tech topics, two phenomena stood out: product journalism and positive coverage. The majority of news articles dealt with products being launched, software, hardware. Other potentially critical tech-related topics, such as censorship, cybersecurity, or privacy issues, were not salient in the tech coverage. And although we had very interesting negative stories about all the tech companies regarding failures, layoffs, investigations, they drew, again, considerably less coverage. In general, the downfalls of tech were less visible. And I'll illustrate that point. So I analyzed each peak in the tech company's timelines to identify the specific story behind the massive coverage, right? So with Apple, you can see that all the massive buzz around the company was in its product launches. Its negative story regarding the terrible working condition at Foxconn with the workers' suicide was where I placed the arrow. Got much smaller interest. So back then we thought we had a huge discussion about it, but the 1 year perspective, this is why I love big data, just gives us the full picture. And this is how a typical pre-techlash year looked like for the tech giants. For decades, we were used to mainly flattering coverage, focus on products and business reporting, in the state of mind, tech optimism. Their innovations are good. We need to encourage their positive impacts on society. The main criticism of tech journalism was around the non-investigative nature of the coverage and the influence of corporate PR. There was this mindset of, if you criticize a company, you're criticizing the spirit of innovation, as if you are against progress. And I think that's the essential background to move to the techlash. Now the full year of tech coverage is all of 2017. Focusing on the big tech companies, the analysis resulted in more than 250,000 records. And for each tech huge story and scandal, we collected the responses of the tech companies, their press releases, posting corporate sites, statements from spokesperson and things like that. And on top of that, I added interviews with the industry itself. So leading tech journalists, tech editors of the New York Times of our world, and tech PR professionals who represent the tech companies, just to hear from them about the broader meaning of the techlash. And after the UK's Brexit referendum and after Donald Trump became president, and specifically during the November-December 2016, the media was covering the whole fake news, misinformation, disinformation phenomenon with greater concern, and of course blaming the tech platforms for its widespread. And so for Facebook, for example, 2017 was a terrible year of bad news. In April, we had the Facebook murder. I don't know if you remember that, but it was the Cleveland shooting video, the first time we had murder in Facebook Live. And the main turning point was the Russian interference with the election, which in here is the Congress testimony with Google and Twitter, but it evolved into a bigger story in 2018 with its biggest scandal to date, Cambridge Analytica. It's when micro-targeting advertising became the ultimate force of evil and Facebook became the least trusted company. And 2017 marked the end of a long tech press honeymoon. In the new techlash trend, more and more headlines presented this line of thought. Tech giants, once seen as saviors, now viewed as threats. And one article perfectly explained, the world is not as forgiving of Silicon Valley as it used to be. At this point, we thought the headlines couldn't get any harsher, and then they absolutely did. Silicon Valley's tax-avoiding, job-killing, soul-sucking machine. In order to explain the tech company's crisis responses to this techlash, the relevant crisis communication theories were corporate apologia, image repair theory, and situational crisis communication theory. They were used to form the conceptual claim regarding tech crisis communication. And here's the picture we got in the content analysis. We saw different companies and situations, and yet the PR responses were very much alike. This is the tech PR template, I'm calling it. So one, the victim-villain framing. We've built something good with good intentions, previous good deeds, and great policies, but our product's platform was manipulated, misused by bad, malicious actors. Two, pseudo-apologies. We apologize, ask for forgiveness, we know we need to do better, we'll do better. They said sorry, so why pseudo-apologies? Well, because they constantly try to reduce their responsibility with all the elements in number one. So we had the good intentions, bad actors, scapegoating, and of course the victimization. We are a victim of the crisis. Three, they all stated that they are proactive. We are currently working on those immediate actions to fix this. Looking forward, we are working on those steps for improvements, minimizing the chances that it will happen again. Many of those steps focused on either changing their policy or AI improvements. And then they added, but our work will never be done, which, if you learned crisis communication, is very unique to the tech industry and the techlash. And it's also connected to the bad actors part, right? Because when they constantly adapt to the changes and evolve, you need to change in accordance, but it also connects to the company's claim that perhaps the problems are too big to fix. Most of the company's responses fell into those template messages. There were rare cases where they either denied the allegations or didn't comment at all, but it wasn't the typical playbook. All of those techlash responses backlashed. The apologies received comments such as, don't ask for forgiveness, ask for permission. And also the manipulated us part, right? Taking the role of the victim. So Kara Swisher, for example, from Recode stated, the Russians did not hack Facebook. They were customers of Facebook. They used it the way it was built to maximize engagement, machine for virality. So we moved to unflattering coverage, focusing on tech scandals, tech scrutiny, and the mindset turned into techno-pessimism. So tech companies' innovations are now viewed as bad for society, so we need to criticize their negative impact. Now, bearing all of this in mind, what would you expect to happen next? Because the way I view it, there's the post-techlash era before the pandemic of COVID-19, and there's the post-techlash era in a post-corona era, and they're going to be different. And I'll explain. The initial claim was that we're headed to an evolving tech policy debate and mounting calls for big tech regulations. My slide from 2 months ago, which feels like 2 years ago, stated that nowadays, journalists are focusing on holding big tech accountable rather than cheerleading, and even competing on who slams them harder. So we can only expect this negative sentiment to expand in the years to come. And also stated that the constant scrutiny would come from a growing number of media outlets and all political sides, as attacking big tech became a bipartisan practice. I said that on top of the current active probes into tech companies and their competitive and privacy practices, the post-techlash era could produce even more investigations on the core issues of the techlash, such as content moderation, ad transparency, misinformation, algorithmic accountability, data rights, and antitrust. But due to COVID-19, I'm now adding a question mark. looking at the tech company's current PR efforts, and I'm following it daily, I can summarize them as if they were saying, we are back being the saviors, right? We are the good guys now. And you want to break us up while we're working on life-saving initiatives? You can do that, right? So it's my interpretation. But frankly, and specifically in the US, the incentive to regulate them diminished. It's in no way a top priority. I'm working on a book entitled The Techlash and Tech Crisis Communication. It includes the conclusion from all three methods I mentioned. So the AI media monitoring of the coverage, the content analysis of the company's responses, and all the insights from the interviews with the tech industry. I asked my interviewees about the evolving power relations between the tech companies and the media who cover them, particularly the rise of investigative reporting in tech. And also, can the companies continue to use this template? How should tech crisis communication evolve under the post-techlash phase, which is also evolving? I believe those questions will become more and more crucial. Gladly, the publisher agrees. The book will be out early next year. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all the aspects of the techlash book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is really interesting stuff, especially right now with COVID-19. So I'm sure we all have many questions for you on that. So we're now moving on to Paul for our last presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for organizing this panel and just all the work on the post-conference, but also just it's a pleasure to be on this panel alongside all of you. Let me see if I can get this to present here. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Okay. So basically, I'm presenting a paper that I'm co-writing with my colleague Yoonmo Sang that looks at the policy preferences of digital platforms and kind of dovetails with Nirit's presentation from just a few moments ago. And the motivating jumping off point for the paper is, the growing recognition that there are jurisdictional and regulatory gaps that need to be addressed in dealing with digital platforms, and a growing series of calls for partnerships between the tech sector and government to address those issues. And these are motivated by the sort of scale and scope and multidimensionality of the big data that is involved, the amount of users that are affected, the geographic span, cross-jurisdictional issues, and so forth. And these calls, which are alternatively called co-regulation, shared governance at the sort of international arena, soft law approaches, are being embraced, I think, in this sort of policy elite level. So this is Tom Wheeler, who oversaw the passage of net neutrality regulation in the United States, just very recently writing that digital companies should have a seat at the table in the development of rules rather than having them force-fed. And you can see the allure of this, right? Especially if you have followed, any of the sort of political hearings around the globe and see, policymakers largely through no fault of their own sort of grappling and having a hard time understanding some of the technical and technological issues involved. And a lot of that has to do with the black box nature of a lot of these issues. But what's underlying this, I think very importantly, is the fact, or an unstated fact, is that this approach presumes or assumes that digital platforms are policy actors, and indeed they are. As any private firm, they can sort of donate to campaigns, donate to causes, but tech specifically has engaged in the electoral politics process. They've lent their data and technological expertise to political campaigns. They've engaged in lobbying. They've engaged in PR, as we've just talked about. The choice to position themselves as platforms versus media companies carries implications for the sort of regulatory approaches that are going to be designed and implemented in regulating these companies. So we wanted to understand, if we are going to consider co-regulatory approaches, what it means for platforms to be policy actors. And so we asked these questions. What policy issues do digital platforms really engage and talk about? What stances do they take on these issues? And I think more interestingly and more importantly for the purposes of this post-conference and this panel, what governance regimes, what regulatory paradigms are buried or explicitly articulated and endorsed within these policy blogs and the policy stance that they have. So I sort of gave away our methodology here. The way we sort of decided to study these questions is by looking at the big five. Our data comes from publicly available policy blogs, all published in 2019, which is admittedly a limited sample. Nevertheless, we also included newspaper op-eds by some of the more prominent of the execs for these companies. And we analyzed them through by looking at the kind of issues that they've covered, by looking at which issues they pay more attention to, which issues they pay less attention to. And then we're also looking deeper as to precisely the kinds of values, regulatory values and regulatory preferences that they, legislative and policy preferences they're communicating. Facebook, perhaps unsurprisingly, turned out to be the most prominent political communicator of the bunch, and Amazon the least, at least insofar as policy blogs as a political communication forum are concerned. So don't worry about reading this graph. The purposes of this graph are really twofold. The first is to draw your attention to the long-tail distribution of policy issue engagement, in that a few issues get a ton of attention, and then very many issues get relatively little attention. However, and the second point here being that what's also fascinating is the breadth and scope of political engagement. These companies are increasingly getting involved in various arenas of political, social, and economic life. And when we look at the more prevalent issues, yes, they tend to dovetail with their business priorities. And in some ways, they are responses to the political scrutiny, or areas where they're receiving political scrutiny, from content moderation, privacy, misinformation, et cetera. But I think they're also, in a way, trying to set agenda for what is worth paying attention to. And I think if there's going to be a discussion of overseeing platforms or regulating platforms, it's imperative to really look at the breadth of issues that they do engage and are active in. So the other point I wanted to make about this spread of issues is, and these posts really, is that they roughly fall into two categories. So the bulk of them tend to articulate initiatives that the platforms themselves are undertaking on various policy areas. And these basically tend to fall along the lines of, this is something that's important, here's what we're doing in this area, and this is why we're successful. In other words, they're arguments for self-regulation in those areas. And their approach has roughly three themes. So we see that they're trying to engage stakeholders to make informed initiatives, make informed decisions, to legitimate their policy engagement, but also inevitably, I think in some way, to dilute and disperse liability, right, for the decisions that they're making. This is paired with, again, unsurprisingly to all of us who have studied this area, with a massive emphasis on technical solutions, AI and machine learning, as well as hiring staff, particularly for content-related areas of hate speech regulation, content or counterterrorism, political advertising, and so forth. And in line with Facebook's announcement of the oversight board, what we're seeing is explicit or implicit calls for, the self-regulation is never fully self-driven, right? There is always some kind of call for oversight, external oversight, public, private. Now, the public part of this is not necessarily government. In fact, often it's civil society, academia, et cetera. And, so we have this model of public-private governance regime in place of state-level regulatory frameworks. And so the second smaller group of policy blog communications tend to address precisely this they're actual preferences of policy preferences. So it's not just initiatives, but here are the things we want to see governments do, right? Here are the policy stances that we adopt. And generally speaking, there is an acknowledgement and a call for tech government partnerships, so classic co-regulatory arrangements. However, interestingly, regulation in this case is often pitched as flexible regulation, which essentially means move fast and break things. And I literally mean, you know, they say things like, go ahead, regulate. If you make a mistake, if you make an error, that's okay, we can fix it later. And what that communicates to us is a profound naivete and misunderstanding of how regulatory agencies understand how bureaucracies move. And I think this is important because what it points to is an incredible incompatibility, potentially, in between tech and government in not only expectations about the outcomes of these arrangements, but also in their goals. So that is something I think that we need to pay attention to as we think about these kinds of arrangements. And then, you know, contrary to these accounts of tech as libertarians who are sort of opposed to any kind of oversight or regulation, that is, you know, I think that's increasingly becoming eclipsed by a recognition that they are in fact asking for very specific types of regulation, very curtailed regulation, whose goal is to create and circumscribe an arena for digital platform governance. And they're saying governments collaborate together and set standards for us, clear, consistent, international in scope standards for AI, data, privacy, speech, definitions of terrorism, so that we may easily enforce them in a consistent, efficient manner. So I think that's the message there. Now, I don't want to get into the specifics because I'm going to run out of time here, but I will focus on the first point here, which I think is kind of important. Throughout, and again, there aren't as many of these blog posts that address specific preferences, but when they do, we see a preference for the American approach to speech regulation, namely more speech over more speech restrictions and exceptions. Likewise, we see a lot more preference for American approaches to competition law over, say, a more aggressive approach that might have problems with business structure, as Russell was saying earlier, for instance, or approaches that may take privacy or data issues into account. So there is very much an implication here for non-US efforts to regulate these companies. Now, you know, zooming out, what does this tell us about, what are the implications for state level policy here? So this is something we're still thinking through, but I think one immediate and sort of obvious thing is that when we're talking about developing oversight of platforms, what we're in some ways have to be thinking about is public-private partnerships that have been built over years now, that are divided and dispersed by policy issue buckets, that are administered by a centralized platform and are international in scope. So that is, I think, in some ways, what we're talking about when we're talking about content initiatives. That is what was being grappled with. And I think related to that somewhat is this issue that's becoming an issue in policy discussions of, do we take advantage of the size of these companies and the resources that they have and sort of settle for an oligopoly or duopoly and, you know, enjoy regulatory efficiency or regulatory scope and scale, if you will, versus some kind of stronger antitrust intervention. I think this question is antecedent to the media versus economic regulation. And then finally, you know, in tune with this sort of first point, I think the research looking at platforms' relationships with civil society organizations, how those relationships are working, is going to be increasingly imperative, considering that a lot of the regulation that is actually happening, or a lot of the initiatives, are self-regulated precisely through these kinds of arrangements. And so with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. That was excellent. Okay, so let's open it up for some questions. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time, but please jump in with any questions that you may have. I just wanted to go to Nirit first. That it'll be so interesting to see what happens following the pandemic, because I mean, I know for me, looking on Facebook, I've seen that the discussion has been so different. Like you mentioned, everybody seems to be really positive around Facebook facilitating communication between people overseas. And you know, all their promotional materials, I've been looking at the comments, and I've seen hashtag I love Facebook, and it's really quite drastic, this change all of a sudden. But I was just wondering, I could see that you've got your 3 theoretical frameworks there, and I'm sure that you don't need to take on any others. But I was wondering if you had heard about, I'm not sure if it's a criminological or a sociological theory called techniques of neutralization by Sykes and Matzer. In that theory, what they do is they look at how perpetrators seek to neutralize their guilt and responsibility for crimes, and they do it in different ways. And it just sounded really similar to some of these ways that you were talking about with the tech companies. So for instance, with offenders, they found that they might deny their responsibility, deny the victim, and yeah, it just sounded really similar. Have you heard about that theory at all?
Unfortunately not. Now I have a reading assignment.
Well, look, I'm sorry. Don't feel like you need to. I'm sure you've got enough
time.
Yeah, it was just fascinating because somebody at QUT did her PhD on, she used techniques of neutralization and applied it to the Catholic Church. And it just showed how it can be applied to institutions. So I don't know, it might be something you'd be interested in looking at, but maybe not.
Well, my background first in the industry and now in academia is PR. So of course, crisis communication theories are my bread and butter. But I didn't use the word deny responsibility. The way I'm looking at it is trying to avoid some of it or reduce responsibility, because they are doing some of the things that, at least in the literature, are accepting some responsibility. Okay, so just to be clear on that. But first, like one step, I want to thank for combining all of us, because I think everything is interconnected, which is very interesting. And I don't want to forget the comment that I want to tell Paul with his work, which I think is very relevant to mine. So I found that your technical solution finding is like the exactly thing that I found of, it was very dominant, that tech will fix tech, right? So first, we glorify AI, glorify the machine algorithms, and then the first fuck up, and it's the first step is to blame them. So we blame the machine now, and then go back to them to save us. So that's like this whole vicious circle that they're doing in their communication. And it, I think, goes across the board. And also the self-regulation part is really just them amplifying again and again and again their previous good deeds. So because we managed to reduce the terrorism and ISIS and child content that we don't want on. So they highlighted that as a reason to, yeah, we can handle all the rest too. So you don't need to regulate us, at least not the way you are looking to do, which didn't answer your question, but I just wanted to tell that to Paul.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, if I can just respond, I guess I agree. Yeah. But I think one other thing that I'm finding interesting is that increasingly, especially in this COVID time, but even with the backlash, what's happening is they are in some ways acknowledging the shortcomings, and they're acknowledging even the research around, particularly in the arenas of bias, algorithmic bias, racism, sexism, etc. They are increasingly not only acknowledging it, but it's not even just a communication response. It's a, let's engage our critics. Let's draw them into the regulatory process, the self-regulatory process, right? To increase, and so what I'm fascinated by, I guess, as a corollary to this is, where does the power lie in that dynamic, right? When you have these groups working together with these tech giants and how effective they can be. Yeah.
This brings to mind, if I can jump in here, this brings to it. something that was prevalent in the network neutrality debates of the US. Sometimes Robert McChesney, Victor Pickard there at Penn, speaks to the notion of ideological closure, of how, a policy is adopted and then it's sort of reverse rationalized as time marches on so as to justify that particular position and that particular power framework. In some ways, engaging the debate itself, sometimes a lack of closure is a form of its own closure, like engaging the critics at the level of here's how race is implicated, gender is implicated, and more. For that engagement to occur, it's like you have this engagement while the ground is moving underneath you in some other direction. So in some ways, there was an article on The Intercept today. We're talking on May 8th for those who are watching this 3 weeks from now. So that Naomi Klein wrote about the first in a series of articles that she's writing about COVID disaster capitalism, I guess. And this is, the governor of New York's new enthusiasm for, Eric Schmidt's techno solutions to all sorts of, social conditions in the state, which is something that she takes alarm to, but it was still, I love me some Naomi Klein, but I feel like the framework she provides, there's still a need for deeper theorization of it. So this relates directly to the work of several of you on this panel. So I just figured I would throw that out there. It was a clumsy ending, but
oh, thank you. Another
it's Friday evening. So, all right.
Fantastic. Yeah, please, no, not clumsy at all, Russell. It's brilliant.
If we have a few more minutes, I would love to hear like Russell and Paul and you about the, how would you imagine the post-techless, post-corona world be now that we know everything we know?
In the US, I mean, and feel free to disagree with me, obviously, but what I'm seeing right now is two things. I'm seeing a greater reliance, a sort of greater turn towards social utility, public utility by these companies, including like particularly Amazon, especially as other companies are basically hurting or going bankrupt. The other is the political situation, which is the only way any of these issues have a chance, I think, of in the long term ever being addressed. And I think one way to theorize this stuff is to think about it through the lens of populism and saying, I mean, I think in some ways, Terry Flew has actually written about this, if I'm not mistaken, but thinking about what these turns mean, and these companies have a very bizarre relationship with populists, but what do populists mean for politically addressing these kinds of things? The AT&T Time Warner merger was a surprising lawsuit by the very conservative and, corrupt Department of Justice in the United States. It's a failed institution. They freed this guy today, Michael Flynn. I mean, it's just insane. So it's very hard to see politically how this is going to play out. In the meantime, of course, tech is building deeper relationships. It's strengthening its robust self-regulatory framework. It's getting deeper embedded, and it's expanding its scope. It's getting into Bitcoin. It's getting into cryptocurrency. It's getting into all kinds of different areas. So I don't want to say I'm not optimistic, but I'm not optimistic. I don't know. Hopefully Russell has a more positive take on this.
Well, I suppose I'm mostly with you on that at the moment. So I will add, there's a spark of optimism to this, and that it's still contingent, right? All this actually, whether the worst ends come to pass, depend on how widely organization happens in a time where we're distancing ourselves physically from each other. But Paul's exactly right, where relationships are being built on both sides of the political aisle right now, including, so even as, in fact, some of the relationships with the Democrats right now are arguably long-term more problematic because so many of the solutions being proposed by the tech giants are the ones that are being entertained the most. So in a sense, I feel pessimistic about the ends of the moment, but only to an extent that if no one does anything about it, then those are the solutions. I think there needs to be a broad push for resources that are similar to those that we are using now, albeit on a public basis. It's showing what kinds of resources we genuinely need to build as a society, because this will not be the last pandemic likely in our lifetimes, you know, given our close interaction with other creatures and such, and, you know, growing human population, this is going to keep happening. So we're learning right now what kinds of platforms we need, and it's up to us to organize to figure out a way to actually subsidize ones that are interested in more than just sucking away our data and putting that to other ends. So in a sense, I'm pessimistic in the short term, and I will be pessimistic in the long term if no broader movement starts to come together to start demanding these kinds of things.